Welcome, everyone, and good morning or afternoon, depending on your time zone. My name is Rebecca Vallis. I am a senior fellow at the Century Foundation. I host the weekly podcast Off Kilter about poverty, inequality, and everything they intersect with. And I am proud to currently serve as secretary of the National Academy of Social Insurance Board of Directors. The COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare myriad public policy failures that long predate the spread of the virus, from a broken healthcare system to a woefully outdated unemployment insurance system to an economy where nearly half of American residents were struggling before the pandemic to afford basics like food, housing, and healthcare. Meanwhile, our public policy choices are a big part of why. For example, the Supplemental Security Income, or SSI program, has been left to wither on the vine for decades. Millions of people with disabilities and seniors, as a result, face woefully outdated and intrusive program rules that trap them in poverty when the program is intended to provide a lifeline out. Indeed, as Senator Sherrod Brown from Ohio noted earlier this week as he gavelled in the first Senate hearing on SSI in a quarter century, the program has been forgotten for so long that even this week's Senate hearing was historic. The most recent Senate hearing focused on SSI was back in 1998, and the last time that the Senate held a hearing examining SSI's benefit adequacy and eligibility criteria was all the way back in 1987. Notably, that hearing was titled The Forgotten Safety Net, and that was more than 3 decades ago. So today, it is an incredibly timely moment to have a conversation about SSI, and we have an incredible panel lined up to discuss it, as well as what might be on deck in terms of current opportunities to reform this long-forgotten program. I'm honored to have the opportunity to moderate today's incredibly timely conversation, and we have a little bit of housekeeping to get through before we get into the panel, but I would like to first at least introduce our incredible panelists who are joining us for this discussion today. Kathleen Romig is a senior policy analyst at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. She was also one of the witnesses who testified in the hearing held earlier this week. Matthew Cortland is a senior fellow with Data for Progress, and also himself a former SSI beneficiary who will be bringing that perspective to today's discussion. Joel Eskovitz is with AARP, and also we want to thank AARP for their generous support of today's event. And finally, Tracy Groniger leads the economic justice portfolio at Justice in Aging and has been a longtime champion, as have all of our panelists, for updating this incredibly important program. A few other housekeeping notes before we get underway. You can participate in today's discussion, which is also being closed captioned and has ASL interpretation, by participating in the chat function, which hopefully folks are familiar with at this point in using Zoom during this pandemic. So you can use the chat function to participate throughout the event, and you can also use the chat and the Q&A functions to ask questions. We will be leaving time at the end of this event for Q&A from the audience, so get your questions ready. Be thinking about what you want to ask these panelists. Meanwhile, as I mentioned, the Academy would like to thank the sponsors of today's event who have made it possible, AARP, as well as the Retirement Research Foundation. Thank you so much for making this event possible today. And then finally, I think we probably should just get into it because there is so much to discuss. So I'm going to welcome my fellow panelists to the screen so that they can join me on the virtual dais here, and we can get this discussion underway. So with that, I'll welcome Joel and Kathleen and Matthew, as well as Tracy. So please join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you all to everyone in cyberspace for joining us today. So first, to kick off this discussion, Kathleen, I'm going to turn it over to you to ask you to lay a little bit of a foundation for us in what is the SSI program, but in particular, what is the history underpinning this important program? It was established nearly 50 years ago, but has largely remained unchanged in those decades since. So Kathleen, please kick us off, if you would, with a little bit of the history of the SSI program.
Sure. Excuse me. SSI, like you said, was established almost 50 years ago in 1972, the Nixon years, and it replaced federal grants to states for old age and disability benefits, and it made them national, and in many cases more generous, but never very generous. Even at the time, policymakers said the goal of the program was to ensure that people with disabilities and elderly people never had to live in poverty. But the benefits have never been enough to keep people out of poverty. So, as Rebecca said, many of the program's features were set in 1972 and just left. And so, in 50 years, or in some cases in 30 years, things have just languished and stayed the same. And so, with each year, the rules get more and more strict and keep beneficiaries lower and lower into poverty.
And Kathleen, staying with you just a little bit, it feels in many ways as we talk about the history of the program, but kind of where it is today, and that's a big part of what we're going to be getting into in this discussion with our panel, is kind of a report card and how is SSI doing today, and what maybe might be the proposals on the table to reform and update and bring into the 21st century, dare I say, this important part of our social security system. Is it fair to say that we're partying like it's still 1972 with these program rules?
Yeah, and I can give you a couple of examples. One is that benefit amount that has increased with inflation over time, which is actually like notable because a lot of the other features of the program hasn't. But it still keeps people in poverty. It's only 3/4 of the federal poverty line, and so that basic amount really hasn't changed over the last 50 years. There are other features that haven't changed at all in decades. And so one of those features is the amount of income outside of SSI that a beneficiary can receive without penalty. And so for someone who has earnings, they can, and this has been unchanged since 1972, almost 50 years, they can keep $65 of what they earned, after which $65 a month. Imagine a job where you earn $65 a month, and then their benefits are reduced $1 for every $2 after that. And so, needless to say, people are still under poverty when they're earning $65 a month, and these reductions start to kick in. Likewise, the reduction for other income, beneficiaries can only keep $20. So a third of SSI beneficiaries get Social Security, for example. On paper, their Social Security benefits average $500 a month, but all they can keep is $20 a month. And that has never changed.
And these are numbers that, just to underscore, it's not like we're saying, oh, these numbers haven't changed over time, just full stop. They haven't even been adjusted for inflation. So what you're describing is nearly 5 decades during which core program rules have not even been updated for inflation. And in some case, the best case scenario, it's only been 3 decades, right, for the asset limits.
Exactly.
And just before we move on, Kathleen, give us a little bit of a snapshot of who receives SSI today.
Sure. Nearly 8 million people total receive SSI. All of them are either elderly or disabled. All of them have very low incomes and very minimal assets. The asset limit that you mentioned is just $2,000 total across all different kinds of assets, or $3,000 if you're in a married couple where both people receive SSI. So that's about 8 million people. About 1 million are children. children can't receive Social Security disability benefits because those are based on work and children haven't worked. And so it's the one source of income support for families who are caring for disabled children. So it's really important. But it's only available to the neediest of those families because of those strict rules. And then, the majority of beneficiaries are working age adults with disabilities, and there are also several million elderly, low-income elderly.
So with that as a little bit of a snapshot to give us a starting point for this discussion, Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you next. I mentioned you're a deep expert in the SSI program. You also bring lived expertise in what it's like to try to live on those incredibly low numbers that Kathleen was just describing. To help us understand, not just in dollars and cents terms, but really what the human consequences are of nearly 50 years of neglect of this program. Would you talk a little bit, Matt, about what SSI meant to you personally, why it's so important for people with disabilities, and what it's like trying to live on sub-poverty level income with a $2,000 asset limit and other kinds of penalties as well?
Of course, I hope won't come as a shock to anyone that trying to live on the current maximum benefit from SSI of $794 per month is hard, really, really hard. And we know it's hard because people aren't of their own free will living on $794 a month. No one is going out into the workforce and saying, you know what, I'm being paid too much money. Can we get that down to 75% of the federal poverty level, please? And when you mentioned it was a particularly timely time to have this conversation, that's exactly right. In part because of the pandemic, right? So we have seen disabled folks, chronically ill folks, about 60 million people in this country have a chronic illness. We've seen costs rise disproportionately on the disability community in trying to navigate a pandemic at a time when America's public health infrastructure has just failed. Hospital systems are taking to Twitter to find bed space. It is a literal hellscape. And money buys safety. If you are chronically ill, if you are disabled, money buys safety. So beyond the normal concerns of not being able to save for retirement, which, by the way, the federal government urges us to do, all of Americans, there are publications out there that are put out by the feds that if you are somehow managed to put away some money while subsisting on a $794 a month maximum benefit, your retirement savings count against that $2,000 asset limit we were talking about. But during a pandemic, of course, costs go up. It's just impossible. It is increasingly, we've taken the degree of difficulty knob and just cranked it all the way up to like 12. We're past 11. We're now at 12. So, in the best of circumstances, $794 a month is not enough to rent even a one-bedroom apartment. Most places in the United States, you're looking at having to live with roommates. Of course, there are absurd draconian program rules we'll get into later that penalize you if you're sharing a refrigerator with someone and your food gets mixed up with someone else. It's just a lot of burden to carry to try to navigate a rule set that even as an attorney licensed to practice in a couple of states, I found difficult and confusing to navigate when I was relying on SSI personally. And to make people go through those hoops, those sort of punishing hoops for a benefit that is at most 3/4 of the federal poverty limit it's cruel as well as insulting. That is, I think, the personal reality for the roughly 7 to 8 million people on any given month who are relying on SSI these days.
And one of the themes that we heard loud and clear in that hearing earlier this week was that the original intent of the SSI program, when it was passed in 1972 and when it was established in 1974, signed into law, as Kathleen mentioned, by President Nixon. The intent of the program was to ensure that disabled and older adults would not need to live on below poverty incomes. I'm quoting congressional intent there yet, just to highlight the contrast with what you have offered, that the maximum SSI benefit is just 3/4 of the federal poverty line. Joel, Matt has talked about why this program is so important for people with disabilities, even if it is deeply inadequate in the ways that we're going to get into in further discussion throughout this panel. But would you talk a little bit about what SSI means to seniors, and in particular to AARP's members? Why is updating SSI something that AARP is committed to as well?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think SSI fits neatly into a lot of other areas that we care about. I mean, the savings piece of it that Matthew highlighted, I think is just one part of it. Caregiving as well is a huge priority for us. And right now, the way that the system is designed, it really comes into conflict with a lot of these priorities. On the savings side, I mean, it's not just retirement savings, it's also rainy day savings. And that's something that we've been pushing a lot, because both of those are ways that people have a little bit more independence and ability to deal with the shocks that they face in life. And so certainly that's a big disincentive to set any kind of money aside in any meaningful way. $2,000 for singles, $3,000 for married couples. You know, you're not going to be able to build any modest nest egg or rainy day fund. And we know, by the way, that studies have shown that folks of all income levels can set money aside. So it's not even a case of, well, you know, lower income folks don't have the money or the ability. That's not true. But certainly, if you're an SSI recipient, if you don't know those rules, you will come to learn them pretty quickly. So that's something that you know, yes, increasing these asset limits, indexing them to inflation moving forward, and the income exclusions, that's a big piece of it, and the caregiving part as well. I mean, these rules are such that, you know, a person's benefits can be reduced by a third if the beneficiary lives in another person's house and doesn't pay for all of his food or lodging. And you know, I mean, Kathleen, I think highlighted this at the hearing this week, but you know, it's the only federal program that counts in-kind support against the recipient. So it's really caregiving, for anyone who has done it or has experience with it. It's challenging on a whole number of levels, dealing with the medical issues and just actually being there. But to add a very bureaucratic system on top of that, where you're trying to figure out what the rules are, as somebody who doesn't do that for a living, you know, that's a bridge too far. So.
And Tracy, I'm going to bring you in next. Justice in Aging also fights for improved economic circumstances for seniors. And a big part of why Justice in Aging has been championing updating the SSI program for an incredibly long time, and you all have really been paving the way for, in many ways, this moment when all of a sudden we're finally starting to have a national conversation about this long forgotten program. A big part of why Justice in Aging has been fighting for updating SSI is not just because it's so important for seniors, but because of how important it is for communities of color. Talk a little bit about how SSI's continued erosion is contributing to racial disparities economically, and some of these outdated rules that we've been hearing about are a big part of what's especially impacting low-income seniors.
Yes, absolutely. I think you're right. Justice in Aging definitely has a focus on communities that have been historically underserved, and communities of color are definitely one of those groups. And SSI is a really important program to address racial disparities that have basically left more people of color in poverty throughout their lives. I mean, the poverty rate of older adults of color is about twice that of older adults who are white. The disability rates are also higher for people of color. But the history of systemic racism in our country basically sets communities of color, people of color, on a path that leads them to be more likely to be extremely poor once they hit retirement age. You know, we all know people of color have lower average wages, higher unemployment. We hear, you know, oh, employment's getting better. And then you look at, you know, rates for people of color and it's a challenge. And also significantly less intergenerational wealth and just wealth in general for people of color. And so this means that when they reach kind of that retirement age, they are going to have significantly less to rely on. And SSI is one of the few programs, and I think the only federal program that gives just cash for people to be able to pay for the necessities that they need, their rent, their food, their clothes. These are kind of the basics that people need. And you would see older adults of color who are already having higher rates of poverty trying to, you know, meet their needs without this really important program. And so the longer that it goes on that we do not kind of update the program and make it do what we intended for it to do, the less assistance communities of color and older adults of color have to address those disparities that just arise over the course of their lifetimes. And I'll note, in terms of, you know, Kathleen mentioned this, and Joel and Matthew too, these income disregards. There are people who are receiving Social Security benefits, but the benefits are very low. And so about half of older SSI recipients also receive some Social Security benefits. Those benefits aren't significant, but the way the program is currently structured, they can't even access those because of this $20 income disregard. And so even if someone has the ability to have some more money, they can't use it. And I'll throw in there that women actually make up the majority of SSI recipients. And for older adults, women are 60+% of SSI recipients. And so these are women who either have been doing work that hasn't counted for Social Security, they've been doing unpaid caregiving work. There's a lot of reasons why women would rely on this program even more. But the fact that the program rules haven't changed means that, again, you're putting a group that has historically faced discrimination into a worse position because we're not updating the program.
Switching gears for a moment from the benefit adequacy and outdated eligibility rules that folks have been discussing, and we're going to get back to all of this shortly. I think we would be remiss if we did not also acknowledge another important theme that we heard in the hearing earlier this week in the Senate Finance Committee, and that was the light that the pandemic has really shined on the access barriers that people face to SSI and the dramatic under-enrollment that this program sees as a result. Kathleen, bringing you back in to talk on this point, what do we know about the awards and applications in the pandemic when it comes to the SSI program? You and many others have been very concerned and ringing the alarm bells that what we're seeing is not what we should be seeing in a moment of significantly greater need.
Right. I mean, I think that's where we need to start, is a moment of significantly greater need. You know, we have more people who are experiencing financial hardship, which, you know, would lead to more people meeting the financial criteria for SSI. We certainly have more people who are sick because of COVID, including some who are experiencing some really significant long haul COVID symptoms. And so one would expect that applications for SSI would go up over this period. In fact, the opposite has happened. And, you know, Many people think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the Social Security's field office operation shut down in March 2020. It still is not reopened to the public. There's some pretty limited by appointment only emergency slots that people can have. And this is particularly important for SSI because most SSI applicants cannot do the application online, meaning the application is not available online. So only certain categories of SSI can even be applied to online. And so that means you either have to call on the phone for several hours to have the intake or go in person. And obviously, a lot of people prefer to be walked through it in person, or they don't necessarily know about the program until they have gone in person and gotten the service there to understand that they qualify for the program and that it is available to them and to get the assistance that they need. And so that's been a major barrier to access, not having, that in-person service from the Social Security Administration during, for over a year and a half. So that's really, really significant problem. As a result, not surprisingly, when you understand all of that, applications have actually gone down significantly to record lows. And awards also have gone down to record lows during this period. So that's really troubling at a time of great need. And SSA is beginning to do some additional outreach. They've noted that it's older beneficiaries or older potential applicants, people with language barriers, and the poorest potential applicants where the application rates have gone down the most. They're starting to do some outreach, but I think it's going to have to be a pretty large effort because, as Rebecca noted, this is not just because of the pandemic. SSI has been dramatically under-enrolled for its entire history, for decades. And, some careful studies have looked into this. Among those who are potentially eligible for SSI, how many apply? There was a big study a few years ago from the Institute of Medicine looking at children with mental health disabilities and low-income children. And they found across 6 major diagnoses that roughly half of children who were probably eligible for SSI didn't even apply. And there are other studies that looked at low birth weight babies, at adults with disabilities, and other groups, and all of them have found that enrollment is about roughly half of the eligible population. And so this needs to be not just a COVID intervention, but something where we look at the long-term problems. Why is it so complicated to apply? What kinds of barriers are people facing? What kind of assistance do they need? And really help them through this process so that people get the benefits they're eligible for.
So about 50% of eligible individuals are being left behind by this incredibly important program that provides survival benefits. And that was a statistic that came to us before the pandemic, to be clear. Matt, I'm going to bring you in next to speak about some of these access barriers, because obviously field offices are part of the story, but not the whole story, given the dramatic under-enrollment we were already seeing before the pandemic. You have often said that you basically need a law degree to access SSI benefits. Talk a little bit about why this program is so difficult for people to access when they need it.
The relationship between the Social Security Administration and people who are applying for SSI benefits is really adversarial. It shouldn't be. And if you take at face value the assertions of the Social Security Administration, it isn't. But if you ever find yourself relying personally on SSI or representing other SSI beneficiaries before the Social Security Administration, and I have done both, what you quickly realize is the process is set up to exclude people who are eligible instead of include people who are eligible. And it's a really important point, because trying to navigate the just tremendous bureaucracy of the Social Security Administration really does require a law degree in order to figure out even how to submit an application for SSI benefits. The application itself is full of tricks and traps. There are questions that leave you 3 lines to answer, where if you actually want your application to be approved, you have to write pages most of the time. There are a lack of options, it's sort of accessible options for applicants to submit an SSI application to the Social Security Administration. So even if you do somehow manage to fill that paperwork out on your own and to know what to say and what boxes to check, it's the Social Security Administration is sort of feels like it's stuck in the late 80s, early 90s, the late 20th century. You can't just pull out your phone in the same way that you might apply for other programs, answer some questions on an app and submit it. It really does require most of the time a face-to-face appointment with SSA employees, which during a pandemic, as you rightly point out, is problematic. It's an airborne infectious disease, and we make people really do face-to-face contact to submit paperwork that has the best chance of being approved. So there are on the application side all sorts of barriers and things that we could be doing to make it easier. An online application, should be able to apply from your phone. Things about chasing medical records, which during a pandemic is particularly problematic as the healthcare system is overwhelmed in a way it has never been overwhelmed before. Submitting record requests, understandably, goes to the bottom of the list for healthcare providers. But once you're in the program, it's also difficult to comply with the terms of the program, the bureaucratic rules of the program, both in terms of understanding those rules, which are very complicated. We were talking about in-kind support and maintenance, where if a relative gives you a bag of groceries because $794 isn't actually enough to live on, and they're trying to help you out so that you literally do not starve. Technically, you're supposed to report that to the Social Security Administration so that they can penalize you by taking away money from your benefit because you've gotten that bag of groceries. Complying with that sort of rule set, reporting income from work. We heard in that Senate Finance hearing that there's a new online way to report any sort of income that you have from work. I can tell you this, it doesn't work. It's just broken. The app is broken. The app that they are so very proud of looks like it was coded by high schoolers, and just doesn't work. So there are all these. Once you're in the system, whenever I would get a letter from the Social Security Administration, my hands would start shaking from the cortisol dump, the adrenaline dump, because I knew that it probably indicated something was wrong through absolutely no fault of my own, because if I, with a Juris Doctorate, can't navigate your program rules are actually at fault. But even having done everything I was supposed to do according to program rules, the other issue is that oftentimes that's still not enough, because it's an adversarial relationship between the Social Security Administration and the people they are supposed to be serving. And so even once you've gotten those benefits, which are absurdly difficult to get, retaining them, even if you are complying with all of the program rules, is still way too difficult. And you shouldn't need to be a lawyer to do it.
And for folks who are following along in the chat, you'll see that we've actually got some audience members sharing their own personal experiences with SSI. So I want to encourage folks to continue to participate in the chat. And I will also encourage folks to check out #DemolishDisabledPoverty, where there has been an ongoing conversation largely dominated by SSI beneficiaries for the past several months, with folks sharing their own personal stories of what Matt is describing, for folks who are looking to learn more in the voices of beneficiaries, as well as folks who are trying to be beneficiaries of this program, but are finding every door closed instead. Joel, I'm going to bring you in last on this point before we move into a discussion about current proposals for reform, and that's to give you an opportunity to speak as well from AARP's perspective about the importance of access to these benefits and making sure that benefit access is a priority for SSI reform, particularly for seniors and from AARP members. This has been a real priority of yours, especially during this pandemic when so many folks have been facing such challenges accessing benefits.
Yeah, and I think Kathleen and Matthew did a really nice job of highlighting some of the particular pandemic challenges. I mean, we certainly hear from a lot of members about field office closures, and I'm very sympathetic to the challenges of reopening face-to-face service and the dangers, and certainly if you're a frontline field office employee, that is very challenging. And we also have members. The SSA has beefed up my Social Security, so for certain types of benefits, retirement benefits, other things, there are people who can do a lot of that online, even requesting certain things. But this isn't that group of people. And I think, SSI application is challenging. DI application online is challenging. And being able to make your way through that process, as Matthew highlighted, and I think has been noted in the chat, all of the issues with trying to get the medical records that you need, is very challenging. So folks that are getting SSI because they're disabled, for instance, that's a real struggle. And so, certainly we don't know quite enough yet about the drop off of the SSI applications to indicate, yes, it's the field office closures. Certainly not helpful. And it would be great. I applaud that the agency and its new leadership is doing work, um, trying to reach out to vulnerable populations. Uh, we would love to get a little bit more understanding of who they can reach out to, because there's also a number of nonprofits and support groups that help people with applications, and right now it feels a bit of a black box, and certainly they're also increasing their mailings to folks to let them know that they could be eligible. But again, this is a transient population, so and especially during a pandemic. So the idea that a mailer is going to reach someone, that might be 2, 3 addresses ago. Who knows? So there have to be multiple ways to reach these people and multiple types of groups that can help them. And to the extent that SSA can do more to publicize who these groups are, where people can turn to for help if they don't have the resources within the field office to do that. That would be really a value add here.
Well, we've talked plenty about the problems, and we could spend our entire time in this virtual event talking about problems, but that's not what we're going to do. What we're going to do is to talk a lot about solutions. That's part of what makes this moment notable, is that not only are we seeing the first Senate hearing in a quarter century, as I mentioned, on SSI this week, but we are actually seeing substantial discussion as part of the national debate right now, and in many ways catalyzed by the national conversation around Build Back Better, about SSI and how we might finally reverse these wrongs of the past 30 to 50 years and restore the program to its original intent. And so with that, I want to turn our discussion now to current proposals for reform and to improve access to the program, and what they would mean for beneficiaries as well as for the agency, which, as we heard in the hearing earlier this week, is having an incredibly challenging time administering the SSI program because its rules are so needlessly complex. And so, Tracy, I'm going to bring you in next to give us a little bit of an overview of some of the current proposals to strengthen SSI, and in particular, starting with President Biden's proposals, which we saw him come out with during the 2020 campaign, and which echo in many ways a piece of legislation called the SSI Restoration Act, which Justice and Aging has been championing in various forms all the way since 2013. So, Tracy, talk a little bit about some of those proposals and what's out there being talked about.
Yeah. So President Biden did specifically commit to making fixes to SSI during his campaign. He really laid out some of the key things that we think are important to improving the program. And as you mentioned, the SSI Restoration Act lays out even more like details about ways that we can improve the program and make it actually fulfill its purpose. But during his campaign, in his platform, President Biden specifically gave some real provisional, like, specificity about how to fix the program. And so, one of the things that he mentioned was bringing the SSI benefit up to 100% of the federal poverty level, which would be really helpful and huge for the millions of people who rely on that money for their housing and food and other basic needs. He also pledged to eliminate that in-kind support and maintenance provision. So this is the provision that Matthew and Kathleen and others have mentioned that penalizes people for getting help with food or rent from family or friends that we don't see in other programs, helping people who are receiving less than a poverty level benefit still meet their needs. And instead of allowing that to happen, they're being penalized. So that would be eliminated. He also pledged to raise the asset limit, which others have mentioned is currently only at $2,000 a month for individuals, or $3,000 for a couple, which, as people have mentioned for a variety of reasons, is really important. And I think, as Matthew said, trapping people in poverty and then telling them, oh, and also you can't save, is basically the opposite of what we would tell anyone who was trying to really kind of create a stable situation. Hey, how about you spend down your money, because otherwise we'll take away that monthly income that you need to live. So really, it just makes no sense. He also mentioned in his campaign eliminating the marriage penalty so that two married SSI recipients would receive the same amount as two single SSI recipients. Again, it just makes sense, and it is something that would obviously benefit a lot of people who are purposefully not getting married because they can't afford to lose that sub-poverty level benefit at all. The SSI Restoration Act is even more comprehensive and has additional improvements that also I think are really important, and I think are supported by a variety of people, including members of Congress, who have kind of highlighted some of these other issues. So, for example, not counting retirement accounts as a resource is part of the SSI Restoration Act. It also includes updating those income disregards, or so that there would be more money that people would be able to keep from either their Social Security earning or retirement accounts, or from their earnings through work. So that would also be something that would be updated as well. So these are just a variety of changes that would really strengthen the program and make it more likely to fulfill its purpose.
And part of what was notable about President Biden's commitment to update SSI was not just because we don't usually hear presidential candidates or presidents talk about the SSI program. That was notable in and of itself. But he made a pledge to ensure that no seniors and no disabled people should ever have to live in poverty in America. That was his commitment as part of his pledge to update SSI. And clearly, updating SSI is part of, but not enough to get to fulfilling that pledge. But it was notable to hear the two really connected as he was laying out his agenda for the disability community and for seniors. Kathleen, what do we know about what these kinds of reforms that Tracy has been describing would mean for beneficiaries. In particular, the Urban Institute actually did some looking at this very question, and in partnership with you all at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. What do we know about what these types of reforms would mean in terms of reduced poverty?
Yeah, that's right. They looked at 4 of the provisions that Tracy mentioned: increasing the benefit amount, increasing those income disregards, getting rid of the marriage penalty, and then getting rid of that in-kind support and maintenance rule, that rule that penalizes people for receiving food and housing and other help from family and friends. And so all together, all 4 of those provisions would reduce poverty among SSI beneficiaries by more than half. It would bring 3.3 million beneficiaries, or 3.3 million people, 3.3 million people out of poverty. So that's pretty dramatic. And then, in addition, increasing the asset limit wouldn't directly impact poverty, because poverty is a measure of income, not of wealth. But that is also a very important poverty reduction tool, because we know that limiting people's savings that way is a poverty trap. We know that if people don't have enough money to weather an emergency or enough money to invest in their futures, that they get stuck in poverty. And so we know that's a proven poverty fighting tool, even if it doesn't show up immediately in the poverty statistics.
And Matt, I again want to make sure that we're not just having a dollars and cents conversation here, but what would these types of changes mean to the disability community? And part of your role at Data for Progress is looking at that not just qualitatively, but also quantitatively through public opinion research. What do we know about how popular these reforms are, in particular with disabled voters, but with American voters overall?
This is one of my favorite kinds of policy areas, because it turns out that doing the right policy is also massively politically popular. So back in May, we pulled the notion of just increasing SSI monthly benefits from that $794 a month that we've been talking about to the federal poverty level, which works out to be about $1,073 a month. Now, that's a difference of about $280 a month. If you're making $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year, that's not a lot of money, but I can promise you, when you're trying to survive on roughly $700 a month, $280 is a massive, massive quality of life improvement. It makes the difference between going to the grocery store and choosing between the copay for your prescription medications and food. That's what that $280 a month does. Is it popular with voters? Yes. Overwhelmingly, 79% of likely voters support increasing the minimum benefit level to the federal poverty level, the maximum benefit level to federal poverty level. It is popular with Democrats. 91% of Democrats support it. It is popular with independent and third-party voters. 77% support it. It is popular with Republican voters. 70% of Republican voters support raising that income level from $794 up to the actual federal poverty level of about $1,073 a month. When we're talking about asset limits, raising them from that $2,000, it's just an absurd number. It keeps people from getting married. So the asset limits are one of the barriers to marriage. As an SSI beneficiary, if I were to have married a partner who had a job, and that job did payroll, on some basis that wasn't every day, that money hit our bank account. Just, one paycheck, get one pay period being a month is pretty common with HR departments now. That would have put us over the asset limit. Just one, even if she was, scraping by, it would have put us over the asset limit. So when we ask voters whether or not they support raising that asset limit from $2,000 to $10,000, let's say, also really popular. 74% of all voters support doing it. 85% of Democrats, 74% of independent and third-party voters, and 61% of Republicans support raising that asset limit from $2,000 to $10K. Now, when we ask voters who self-identify as disabled, people who are, by virtue of their day-to-day lives, experts on surviving in this country as a disabled human, it really shouldn't surprise anyone that disabled respondents overwhelmingly support raising that asset limit from 2,000 to 10,000. Total support is about 78% of disabled voters. They also support raising that monthly income amount from $794 to $1,073. 83% of disabled respondents supported raising the income limit, the monthly income support amount from $794 to $1,073. It's just all of the policies that we're talking about are just incredibly popular, because when you explain to people, even in broad strokes, how punishingly, gruelingly, just grindingly difficult the rules make SSI for people who rely on SSI, you really do. It's almost a self-proving case. People sort of really do understand it at a very basic level how unfair it is, and so we see support for updating basically every asset of this, every facet of the program. We also see support for updating those income disregard rules. 77% of all voters support that, 86% of Democrats, 76% of independent and third-party voters, and 69% of Republicans. We don't see things that poll this well across party lines that often. Like this is like you're going out, panning for gold, and the first time you get there's a big old chunk of it. I am reaching for metaphor and failing wildly. That's how unique this polling data is. So it is both good policy and incredibly politically popular.
And I put a link in the chat to that polling because you were spewing a lot of numbers out there, and I want folks to be able to go and take a look. Data for Progress and the Century Foundation polled all 5 of the key commitments on SSI that President Biden made, and which Tracy was walking through before. So you can find that link in the chat and dig through all the numbers that Matt was just walking through there. Joel, what would these improvements mean for seniors? We've been hearing a lot from Matt about what they would mean for people with disabilities in particular, but what would these changes mean for AARP's members?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a tendency to think that this is just something that impacts the 8 million folks that are currently getting SSI, or certainly if the standards were changed, a larger group of folks. But as we've touched on, most people don't get through this system just by themselves, and so there's a lot of other folks, relatives especially, but also various support groups that also are impacted by this. And I think, as we learned during the pandemic, this is a time of high anxiety. And so family members who are concerned about the health and financial security of their older relatives, again, there's a lot of sandwich generation folks who are helping out older relatives, and they're caught up in this as well. And the idea that, I worry about, my parents following mask rules and things like that, let alone, having to try to get through all the complexities of this. And so I think the fewer number of hoops that you have to jump through, and the fewer number of rules that, again, most people don't necessarily understand, would be, I think, the peace of mind value of that would be enormous. And again, just making this process slightly easier. I think we've seen some of these benefits during the pandemic, like the child tax credit, where it just shows up in your bank account, and how easy something like that can be. And then you compare that to something like this, and it's really quite a large hurdle for folks to overcome. And so I think that would provide a lot of peace of mind for a lot of folks, not just those receiving it, but also those helping to support them, and being afraid that their help, I think as someone noted in the chat, that their help is actually harmful. And so, that's not something that any family member should have to go through to, I'm helping house or get groceries for somebody, but because I did that now, there's a punishment element to that for the SSI recipient. So, those types of Sophie's Choice type things, situations are really hard. And to the extent that that doesn't have to happen, that would be great.
A really important point about families. We're going to get in just a moment into, I think, what a lot of folks are really wanting to hear about, which is current prospects for reform. Do we have a shot at seeing any of these changes happen? And we're going to be getting into that in just a moment. But Kathleen, I want to bring you in finally on this point before we move on, because the flip side of the coin, and most of what we've been focused on, has been how incredibly burdensome and complex these rules, and many of the outdated rules that we've been talking about that would be updated by the SSI Restoration Act or by President Biden's proposals in his campaign plan. We've been talking about what they mean for beneficiaries. But the flip side of the coin is how complicated the SSI program is for the Social Security Administration to actually run and manage. And that was a significant theme that we heard in this week's hearing. We saw Stephen Evangelista, who heads up disability and retirement policy for the Social Security Administration, as one of the witnesses. We also saw Elizabeth Kurta from GAO, the Government Accountability Office, both of them speaking at length about how complicated SSI is to administer for the Social Security Administration. So by contrast, what would simplifying the rules, what would these updates that we're talking about in the SSI Restoration Act mean for the agency? This is something you've done a lot of thinking about.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, I worked at the Social Security Administration for 8 years, and believe me, people there find this to be very, very complicated and very frustrating to administer. It's tough, and it's expensive. It's wasteful because one thing that struck me actually at the hearing, I even wrote it down on a little post-it note that Stephen Evangelista said. Nearly every change in a beneficiary's life can affect his or her benefit amount. And he named moving, getting a bag of groceries, having a different number of hours that month. And not only that, but it can change, like the benefit when paid can be accurate, but then it's considered an improper payment because of a change that has occurred later on into that month. And so people, talk about, oh, there's errors in the program. Was that really an error that you failed to see the future, that person's hours at their job changed that month, or that person got an extra bag of groceries that month? And so, we've been hearing all the details of these very, very low thresholds and these very, very intrusive rules. We didn't even get into stuff like quizzing people about whether they represent themselves to be married, even though they're not. That's something that Social Security employees actually have to ask people. And so it's expensive. SSI benefits are only 5% of the money that SSA pays in benefits every month, and they eat up 35% of the administrative budget because it's so hard to keep up on these changes month to month, to go through this long laundry list of questions all the time and to go back and make adjustments. It's really, really expensive. And we would be able to give better service to the public, better service to all seniors, all people with disabilities, if we weren't so tied up getting up in people's business, to be honest, and also to have these, really, really outdated rules that you can just go over them by $1 and change things.
It's such a notable statistic, and it bears repeating because it really sums up, I think, a lot of what we've been talking about here, at least from the agency perspective. 35% of Social Security's administrative budget is spent running SSI, despite the fact that SSI benefits make up 5% of the agency's total payouts. So that really quantifies and puts numbers to how incredibly complex and burdensome these rules are. And I think many of you are agreeing, needlessly so. Let's get into now, I think, the thing that most people are most excited about right now in this conversation. And actually, as we're talking, my phone has been blowing up with text messages from Academy members who are saying they've got questions. I guess they're bypassing the chat. Folks, please put your questions in the Q&A function and don't text them to me. But many people are asking the same question, which is, do we actually have a shot at seeing some of these long overdue SSI improvements happen right now? Or if not now, when? So let's get right into that for the balance of our time. And then folks, be thinking about the questions you want to ask, because once we get through this next section, that is when it is your moment to ask questions. So you can be putting them in the Q&A right now. So Kathleen, I'm going to stay with you for the first element of this question, given that one of the things that I think folks are wondering, because there is all this conversation right now about Build Back Better and economic recovery legislation offering really a once-in-a-generation opportunity to update many other elements of our safety net and our public policy infrastructure. Is SSI something that can be changed in reconciliation? We are hearing it talked about a lot in the context of Build Back Better.
Yes, absolutely. SSI can be changed in reconciliation. It has been several times in the past. And just to give a brief review of what reconciliation means, it's basically a way to override the filibuster rules. So it's a way that as long as you are abiding by certain parameters, you can pass a bill with a simple majority in the House, and then 50+1 votes in the Senate, which means it can be done on party lines. And so and I just think it's important to note, one of those rules that comes into play here, and this is a question that I get very often, well, why are you only talking about SSI? Why aren't you talking about Social Security disability insurance? Why aren't you talking about Social Security for older Americans? Why are you only talking about SSI? And the reason is, we are not allowed to make changes to Social Security and reconciliation. That is outside the rules for reconciliation. But SSI is most definitely able to be changed in reconciliation. It was not included in the House marked up bill that has passed so far, but that's not the end of the story. And I'm sure that Rebecca's going to get us into that, but it absolutely could be.
And we were actually seeing press clips from the hearing with Senator Sherrod Brown, who chairs the subcommittee on Social Security, which convened that hearing earlier this week, with Sherrod Brown saying he is actively fighting, and many others in the Senate are as well, to ensure that SSI is not left behind in the final package. I noticed in one of those Ohio press stories this moment, Sherrod Brown saying he believes that asset limits may already be in the package as they're shaping it, and that he's hoping for more as well. So I think some bullishness from Senator Brown for sure on the chances of trying to get at least something from this list into that package. Tracy, I'm going to bring you in next to talk about something we haven't discussed yet, but which we would be absolutely remiss if we did not get into just a little bit, and that is Puerto Rico and the territories. One of the really important points to make in terms of long overdue updates to SSI is that SSI is not currently extended to residents of Puerto Rico, nor of the territories in the U.S., despite the fact that those residents are U.S. citizens. Talk a little bit about that aspect of the conversation, which is now also starting to get some real national attention.
Yeah. So you're right that people who are U.S. citizens, if they were living in the United States continent and were receiving SSI, would lose it if they were living in Puerto Rico or other territories. So currently, people who are citizens living in the territories don't get SSI. There's currently a case that is about to be heard before the Supreme Court that challenges that. and that would extend SSI to people who are living in Puerto Rico. In this case, U.S. versus Valle Madero was brought because a person who had been living in New York moved to Puerto Rico and then was told that he had been overpaid because he moved to Puerto Rico and therefore could not receive SSI. The U.S. Court of Appeals in the First Circuit found that this was unconstitutional, that this violated the Equal Protection Clause. When Trump was president, the Department of Justice appealed that decision to the Supreme Court. And when Biden took office, he had an opportunity to have DOJ withdraw that appeal and allow residents of Puerto Rico to receive SSI. His administration chose not to do that and said that they were going to defend the constitutionality of federal statutes. I think that was a horrible decision, and I'm sure many people agree. And so instead of withdrawing the appeal, they let it stand, and the Supreme Court granted the government's petition. And so there are going to be oral arguments scheduled for November, I believe, of this year to determine whether or not people in Puerto Rico will be able to get access to SSI. So we'll see what happens there, but it's an important program, and people in Puerto Rico who have very high rates of poverty would benefit from these benefits. I mean, it would just make a huge difference to people who are living in Puerto Rico and territories.
Kathleen, one of the questions that I think many folks probably have is what can be done administratively? We've focused almost entirely this discussion so far on what can be done legislatively, and legislation like the SSI Restoration Act is what gets, I think, a lot more attention than some of the things that the agency itself actually has the ability to do. What can be done without legislation? And I'm going to make this, I think, our last question before I turn to audience Q&A, because I've got several that have come in that I think are perfect questions for us to kick off with. What can be done administratively?
I'll make it quick. There are basically two main areas. One is in simplifying these rules. Not every single one of these rules is set out in the statute, so not every one of them requires legislation. In-kind support and maintenance is a good example. A lot of those details about what counts and doesn't count is in regulation. And so, for example, it used to be that if somebody bought you clothes, that counted toward your in-kind support and maintenance, and that's no longer true because of an administrative change. We could do the same thing with food. We could change what in-kind support and maintenance means. Congress would have to repeal the whole thing if we wanted to get rid of it altogether, but we could certainly change it and make it easier and not so onerous. Another thing we could do beyond simplifying the rules is what we kind of already touched on, which is making the program easier to access. And the acting commissioner, Kilolo Kijakazi, has said that her number one priority is removing barriers to Social Security's programs. And there's a lot that the agency can do to remove barriers to people from accessing SSI and Social Security Administration's other programs. And we've talked about those a bunch. Outreach, simplification, and assistance are the main three ways to do that.
And I'm going to stay with you for one selfish moment here, because I think there's one other thing that would be good for folks to get to hear about that the agency can do administratively, and which we've started to hear might be something that is under serious consideration. And that's part of the in-kind support and maintenance rules that we were hearing about before. Is that right?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. It's not just in theory. In practice, it is on the agency's regulatory agenda. Yes. So that is actually in motion. Thank you, Rebecca. That's in motion. And we really hope that is going to keep going. And we would encourage people to comment and say that would be a good change for both the agency and for beneficiaries.
Deeply exciting. So opening it up now to audience Q&A, and also apparently my text messages, which also have some really good questions in them too. Sorry to be looking down at my phone, but I want to get in some of these good questions that we're getting. The first question I'm going to toss, I think, over to Matt. And that question is, that if SSI is a priority for the disability community and for demolished disabled poverty, as you've been talking about today, how does the push to update SSI as part of Build Back Better fit with the disability community's push to invest in home and community-based services, which are also essential for people with disabilities and also seniors in the spirit of community integration? So that's a terrific and really timely conversation, given how important the push for what is often called HCBS is as well for the disability community.
It's a good point. My answer is fairly simple. We can require two whole things. Two things. Look, we are still in the midst of a pandemic that has disproportionately killed disabled people in this country. More than 135,000 residents of so-called skilled nursing facilities, nursing homes, institutions are dead. They're dead. They didn't have to die. They were killed by COVID, but they were also killed because we warehouse people in this country in facilities that most humans with free will would never choose to walk down the hall of, never mind be confined to. Home and community-based services are the alternative to institutionalizing people. They are wildly politically popular. It's also the right policy decision. It's absolutely true that we must invest in home and community-based services. There are about 800,000 people on waiting lists, on Medicaid waiting lists. There are about 28,000 children in Texas on waiting lists for care that will enable them to stay at home with their families. It's a disgrace, and it needs to be fixed. At the same time, requiring human beings to live on an average monthly benefit of $580 a month is also a disgrace and also must be fixed. Preventing disabled Americans from marrying the people they love is also a disgrace and must be fixed. Penalizing SSI beneficiaries who are fortunate and lucky enough to have support with housing or groceries or medications is also a disgrace and must be fixed. We are in the midst of omni-crises right now. It should come as no surprise to anyone. And for a community that has disproportionately borne the brunt of death, I feel like I've fallen through the looking glass, except none of it is as charming as the movie. We're surrounded by people dying all the time. 135,000 people in nursing homes. I'm hesitating because I got a phone call last night that someone I am responsible for, who is in a nursing home, because we do not provide home care to some zip codes in this country, and they are the zip codes that you would think. They are the zip codes that tend to be poorer. Was rushed to an emergency room with a presumptive positive COVID result as they were desatting. So my response is fairly straightforward. We can do more than one thing at a time, and we have to if we're going to keep people alive. We have to raise benefit levels. We have to increase the asset limit. We should get rid of the in-kind support and maintenance rule. Administratively, we should do whatever we can to narrow it. We should make SSI more accessible by undoing the damage that the Trump administration did through policy vandalism of doing things like saying your treating physician no longer gets controlling weight when the Social Security Administration is trying to figure out your medical condition. We have to do all of that. We also have to fully fund HCBS. We have to do both. We have to do both. If people are going to stay alive, we have to do both.
I'm going to continue to move through some of the audience questions that we've got coming in. One of them is, Are there any areas with bipartisan agreement or potential bipartisan agreement? And did we hear anything in this week's hearing that might answer that question? Kathleen, you had a front row seat to that hearing, and in fact, you were one of the people who was taking questions from members of Congress of both political parties. Do you want to take that question? And I believe the answer may actually be yes.
Yeah, the answer is yes. That was my favorite part of the hearing. Senator Langford, upon the discussion of how we treat earnings in SSI, said it's just not right to penalize people for working like that. And he said those income limits, both of them, must be raised. And then he also further said that the marriage penalty just wasn't okay. We don't want to discourage marriage among people, and that's what those rules do. And so I thought that was really interesting, and I know that's something that disability advocates and others want to follow up on with the senator and continue to discuss. Probably not everything is going to make it into this package, much as we would like it to. And I think we have lots of other avenues. Tracy was talking about Puerto Rico. We're talking about regulatory changes for ISM, and this is yet another avenue to pursue. This reconciliation package is the beginning; it's not the end. We're going to keep advocating for changes. I mean, first and foremost in this package, but we're pursuing all the angles.
And you're getting into one of the other questions that I think we're receiving in lots of different formats here. Folks are asking, how do we get this passed? Folks are asking, what's the road ahead? How do we do this? We're kind of getting flooded with questions of how does this actually become law? Matt, do you want to pick it up there and maybe talk a little bit about what we expect as the road ahead with this economic recovery debate, which, as Kathleen mentioned, is definitely not the end of opportunities to update SSI, but may be the beginning of the first chance in decades.
Yeah, so right now we're still obviously in the middle of this reconciliation process. It's not clear, it's not figured out, it's not settled what will be included in the bill. In terms of disability community priorities, there's HCBS and there's SSI, and I was in a meeting with Leader Schumer this morning, right after he had met with principals to figure out funding. So obviously, given the current Hill dynamics, what is possible depends in large part on revenue raisers, and that framework has recently been agreed. Senate Finance Committee Chair Wyden has been very enthusiastic about raising revenue from taxes on the ultra wealthy who engage in such abusive practices as parking $5 billion in an IRA. Peter Thiel, I'm looking at you, which is just absurd when, as a disabled person who relied on SSI, not only could I not have $5,000, never mind $5 billion, I couldn't have it in an IRA because that would count against asset limits. Also, if I were to marry someone and they had an IRA or for any sort of retirement account, it would be counted against my asset limits. So that those negotiations are ongoing. I would encourage everyone to weigh in with your U.S. senators. You can also reach out to the majority leader and tell them all how important updating SSI is to you, so that there is some slice of money that makes it through this process for SSI. There's also, as has been pointed out, things that the administration can do administratively. I agree with Tracy. The administration failed its first test on SSI policy when it chose to not withdraw, which it had an absolute right under Supreme Court rules to do, the appeal that the previous administration lodged of the First Circuit decision, which would have, through court order, extended SSI benefits to Puerto Rico. There are other opportunities for the administration to do better, for the Biden and Harris administration to do better when it comes to the 8 million Americans who rely on SSI to pay the bills. Those are, some of the administrative things that we talked about here. But the important point, and I'll close with this here: there's no lobbying firm for this. there are no K Street lobbyists. There are no big dollar donors. You are, if you are watching this, looking at a large portion of the SSI advocacy community is on your screen right now. It's us. This is not something that attracts a lot of big ad buy budgets. There's no digital campaign here. I don't have a media booker, right? Like, this is a very sort of grassroots campaign. What that means, though, is that each individual who weighs in is actually moving the needle. So, we need all the help we can get. And procedurally, that's where we are.
One of the questions that has come through in a couple of different forms, Joel, I think would be perfect for you. And it's actually something that has also been texted to me because folks are wondering, how does this fit, I think, with Social Security? So Kathleen mentioned that SSI is a program that is able to be changed in reconciliation, that budget reconciliation process that is currently being deployed for the economic recovery debate that we're watching play out in Congress right now. And SSI has been used in reconciliation, has been changed in reconciliation in the past, but that Social Security cannot be changed in reconciliation, which is why so much more attention right now is being paid on SSI and some of its needs for reform compared to, say, the Social Security disability insurance program, which also is very much in need of reform, as was mentioned earlier. Once we are through this economic recovery debate, which many of us, I think, would really like to be through sometime soon, because it has been sort of the endless, ongoing emotional roller coaster in Washington. Once we are through the economic recovery conversation and that so-called Build Back Better debate, how do you see SSI fitting into a larger conversation about strengthening Social Security? That's a larger conversation that AARP pays a lot of attention to and focuses on a great deal because of how much that matters to your members as well.
Sure. And I think it's helpful to point out that SSI is sadly not the only program that suffers from an outdated structure. I think one of the other big pieces of Social Security that is aimed at this universe of people is the special minimum benefit. And this 2021 may be the last year that actually is in effect, because basically, although it is indexed, unlike SSI, it is indexed to prices and not wages, and that moves slower. And so I think we're down to 0.05% of the population that is receiving the special minimum, 32,000 people in 2019, as opposed to over 200,000 in 1991. But that is aimed at a group of long-term, low-wage workers who it's a top-up basically on their benefits because of how little they've earned. And so there are a number of programs like that have bipartisan support because they are looked at as a way to, again, raise that floor. And so that's something that will need to be looked at because it will be only really there in theory and not in practice, maybe as early as next year. And there are other efforts, I think, to look at who the program is not helping or who is being hurt. The full retirement age is creeping up to 68. And so for every month that moves up, people that are just kind of limping to 62, for instance, they are seeing essentially a benefit cut because of the reduction. And so the Academy actually, Rebecca, you're part of this as well, is working at looking at these populations of folks who can't work longer because of the type of work that they do, and who are, right now getting hurt by the raise of the retirement age. But also, I think there is this tendency to think that, everybody's living longer and everybody, can have a later retirement age and things like that. And the program increasingly, should maybe reflect what the facts on the ground are, which are that, not everybody's living longer, and not everybody can work longer. And so, in a lot of the modernization context, not just with the special minimum benefit, I think there needs to be a lot more room for discussion for, there are lots of different people that receive it. It's a great program because it's a universal program, but it needs to reflect the varying experiences of the recipients.
One of the questions that's come through is, and I'm going to paraphrase this, is raising SSI benefits to the federal poverty level enough? The question also notes that housing vouchers are not widely available for folks even who are eligible, which is itself its own whole conversation we could have, but is definitely related to this conversation, given that housing inaffordability is a big part of what SSI beneficiaries face because benefits are so low. Matt, I'm going to take that question over to you to ask, is raising SSI benefits to the federal poverty level enough? And is it enough and are benefits today, let me get this right, we're looking at the question, and are benefits today enough for beneficiaries to be able to afford housing?
No. Federal poverty level is too low. We all know that. However, an additional $280 a month is better than no additional dollars a month. Ideally, no one in this country would be living in poverty. Ideally, no federal program would be premised on the notion that it was going to enforce people living below the federal poverty level, but that's where we are. The political reality is far from ideal. The simple fact is that there is not the political support to get SSI to 125 or 150% of FPL, even though that would be the sort of rational and humane thing to do. That the political support just isn't there. So we are, I keep resorting to cliche today, I'm sorry. We are trying to do the art of the possible right now with SSI. And what exactly is possible is my phone has been I'm getting text messages here about what the window of possibility is in as this very messy Hill process continues. Ideally, SSI and other disability benefit programs in this country would recognize that no one should be living in poverty. It should recognize that there's something called what we in the community call a disability tax. It turns out that existing in the United States of America as a disabled person is more expensive by virtue of having a disability or disabilities than being non-disabled. It costs more for healthcare. I don't even know how many medications. I think 20 was the most medications I was on. Those medications were largely paid for by Medicaid, but there was a $3.65 copay, which when your benefit is about $700 a month, it really does eat into it. There are just all these ways that instead of supporting folks, recognizing the disability tax, we nickel and dime folks who are disabled. And should it be that way? No. We are operating in a far from ideal reality, though.
And we are coming up on time, so we're going to run short on getting through the rest of our questions. But I want to encourage folks to email questions that they have following this panel to the Academy. Folks are on hand and are very interested in keeping up the conversation after the event concludes. I also want to invite folks to weigh in at #DemolishDisabledPoverty, where the conversation is going on all the time, and lots of folks who are very focused on SSI SSI right now are not just sharing their stories, but are also actually weighing in and answering questions that folks are posing, as well as providing updates on sometimes a day-to-day basis about what's going on in Washington around this debate and around the Build Back Better debate and how things like SSI and home and community-based services fit in. So that hashtag again is Demolish Disabled Poverty. Today's event has been recorded, so folks can find it on the Academy website, nasi.org, to see a recording. And I want to invite everyone to thank our fantastic panelists today. Matthew Cortland from Data for Progress, Kathleen Romig from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, Tracy Groniger from Justice and Aging, and last but certainly not least, Joel Eskovitz from AARP, who also we need to thank for making today's virtual conversation possible, as well as our friends at the Retirement Research Foundation. Thank you to all of you for joining us for this very, very timely conversation. And I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone out there who's here with us, and also those who are out there in cyberspace who have been working to elevate the conversation about SSI in this incredibly critical moment. We are seeing discussion of this program, which has been forgotten, as we've talked about, for almost 30 to 50 years. We are seeing discussion at levels that this program is just not familiar with, including news stories in major news outlets and members of Congress not only remembering it but really talking about it and trying to encourage their colleagues to learn about what should be considered a national scandal, which is how long beneficiaries, 8 million beneficiaries who are disabled and older folks, have been forgotten and left to wither on the vine. So I hope that the next time that we are having a conversation about SSI, we're getting to debrief and explain some of the improvements that maybe we're starting to see happen either legislatively or administratively or both. And I thank the Academy for hosting today's incredibly important as well as timely conversation. So with that, thank you so much for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you at future National Academy of Social Insurance events. Take care and be well, everyone.